A gravel road, fences on both sides, nowhere to turn, and behind her, closing fast, 9 feet of muscle and feather doing 40 miles an hour on legs, built like something out of a nightmare engineering diagram. No trees, no gate, no car. Just a straight farm road, and a bird that had already decided this was his road, not hers. What she did in the next stretch of that road, and why an animal most people picture as a punchline actually belongs on the same danger list as animals 3 times its size, is the whole story today. Before we get into it, if you like stories where the danger comes from somewhere nobody expects, subscribe now, because we're about 30 seconds in, and this is exactly where it decides whether you catch the next one. Okay, let's get to the road. Ostriches get treated like a joke almost everywhere they show up in popular culture. Head in the sand, silly long neck, cartoon legs, the bird equivalent of a punchline rather than a predator or a genuine threat. That reputation is almost entirely wrong, and it's wrong in a way that gets people seriously hurt every single year, mostly on farms, ranches, and the growing number of ostrich and emu operations that have popped up across drier regions of the world over the past few decades as alternative livestock. An adult male ostrich, the kind involved in this story, can stand over 9 feet tall, weigh close to 350 pounds, and run in sustained bursts up to 43 miles an hour, which for context is faster than a racehorse's top recorded speed, and comfortably faster than the fastest human being who has ever lived over any meaningful distance. That speed alone would make an aggressive ostrich a genuine problem. What makes it a genuinely dangerous animal, not just a fast and startling one, is what's attached to the end of each of those legs. An ostrich's leg ends in a 2-toed foot, and the larger of those 2 toes carries a claw that can run 4 inches long, essentially a built-in blade mounted on a limb, capable of generating kick forces that veterinary researchers studying ratite anatomy have measured as strong enough to cave in a car door, or, in documented cases, going back decades on farms across South Africa, Australia, and the American Southwest, disembowel a full-grown lion. That's not folklore. Ostriches are one of the only prey animals on the African savanna capable of killing a lion in a direct confrontation, and they do it almost exclusively with that single forward kick, a straight driving strike delivered with the same leg mechanics that let them run at highway speeds, which means the kick isn't a swipe or a peck, it's closer to being struck by a piece of farm equipment. The woman in this story, we'll call her the farmhand because her specific identity isn't really the point of the lesson here, was 26 years old and had been working part-time on a mixed livestock property for about 8 months, mostly handling feed runs, fence checks, and general maintenance across a spread that included cattle, a small flock of sheep, and, added about a year before she started, a breeding pair of ostriches kept in a large paddock at the far end of the property, connected to the main farm buildings by roughly half a mile of straight gravel road running between 2 fence lines with almost no cover, no side exits, and no real shoulder to speak of, just packed dirt tracks worn down by the same pickup trucks that use the road every day. That road is the entire stage for what happened next, and it's worth understanding exactly why it turned into the trap it did. Because farm roads like this one exist for reasons that have nothing to do with animal containment and everything to do with equipment access, which is precisely why they can become such a dangerous place to be caught with a large, aggressive animal loose. The fences on either side of that particular stretch weren't ostrich rated. They were standard livestock wire meant to hold cattle and sheep, 4 feet high, easily cleared, or pushed through by a bird whose legs alone stand taller than most of the fencing meant to contain it. And on that particular morning, during a routine check of the paddock latch after a windstorm had rattled through the property overnight, the male ostrich, an animal she'd worked around for the better part of 8 months without serious incident, had found the gate improperly secured, likely jarred loose by the same wind that had been battering the property since the night before, and walked straight out onto the exact stretch of road she was walking down toward him. This is where we need to talk about ostrich behavior specifically, because the reason this male reacted the way he did wasn't random aggression. It was a very specific, very well-documented seasonal pattern that anyone working around breeding ostriches learns to respect, or eventually gets hurt ignoring. Male ostriches during breeding season, which on most farms runs through the warmer months and can stretch longer depending on climate and management practices, become intensely territorial, and unlike a lot of territorial animal behavior that's directed mainly at other members of the same species, breeding male ostriches frequently extend that territorial aggression to humans, particularly humans moving through what the bird has claimed as his space, and particularly when a female is nearby, which she was, still inside the paddock, visible through the gap in the fence line where the gate had swung open. In the eyes of that male, at that moment, on that morning, the farmhand wasn't a familiar person he'd shared a property with for 8 months. She was an intruder, walking directly toward his mate, on a stretch of open ground he had every physical advantage to defend. The behavioral shift, when it happens, is fast, and it is unmistakable to anyone who's seen it before, though it can look almost comical to someone who hasn't, which is part of what makes it so dangerous. The bird's neck, normally held in a relaxed, gently curved posture, snaps into a rigid, extended position, held low and forward rather than up, the head dropping to roughly the same height as the intended target's torso, rather than towering above it, the way an ostrich's neck usually does when it's simply alert or curious. The wings, which spend most of the day folded neatly against the body, spread out and drop, held loosely away from the sides in a display. Researchers who study ratite behavior generally interpret as both a size amplification signal and a balance mechanism the bird uses right before committing to a full charge or a kicking strike, since those same wings play an active role in the bird's ability to pivot and change direction at speed, despite being flightless. And the legs, already doing most of the visible work in a standing ostrich, begin a distinctive stiff-legged strut, exaggerated, almost march-like steps that farm workers who deal with ostriches regularly describe as the single most reliable early warning sign that a charge is coming, because it shows up consistently, seconds before the bird actually breaks into a run, giving anyone paying attention a genuine, if brief, window to react. The farmhand caught that posture change from about 80 yards out, close enough to recognize it clearly, but far enough that, for a fraction of a second, her brain ran through the same kind of denial almost everyone experiences in the opening moment of an animal encounter that's about to turn dangerous. A half-beat of hoping the shape resolves into something less alarming than what it actually is. It didn't. The neck was down, the wings were out, the strut had started, and then, closing the remaining distance with a speed that farm workers who've witnessed ostrich charges consistently describe as almost impossible to reconcile with how the bird looks standing still. He broke into a full sprint, straight down the center of the road, directly at her, with absolutely nowhere for either of them to easily peel off to the side. Let's talk about that speed for a second, because it's the single fact that makes this entire encounter as dangerous as it was. 43 miles an hour sustained is a number that's genuinely hard for most people to translate into lived experience until they're the one being chased by it. At that speed, an ostrich covers roughly 63 feet every single second, which means from 80 yards out, roughly 240 feet, a fully committed charge closes that entire gap in well under 4 seconds. 4 seconds is not enough time to run to any meaningful cover on an open farm road with no trees, no vehicles, and fence lines too tall and too far away to reasonably scale before being caught, and it's certainly not enough time to outrun the animal directly. Since no human being on Earth has ever come remotely close to matching that sustained speed over any real distance, world-class sprinters hit their absolute peak velocity somewhere in the range of 27 to 28 miles an hour for a few strides at most before decelerating, less than 2/3 of what a determined ostrich can hold for a sustained chase. So what did she actually do with those 4 seconds? Because, exactly like every other encounter worth breaking down, recognizing the danger and surviving it are two completely separate problems, and the second one depends entirely on what's already loaded into your body before the moment arrives. She did not run in a straight line away from him, and this detail matters more than almost anything else in the entire sequence. Running directly away from a charging ostrich down an open road plays directly into the one thing the bird is built to dominate absolutely: straight-line pursuit speed on open, flat ground. It's the worst possible terrain and the worst possible direction for a human being to try to outrun that particular animal, because it hands the entire physical advantage straight to the exact skill set the ostrich evolved specifically to exploit. Instead, drawing on something she'd actually been told almost in passing by the property owner months earlier, one of those pieces of advice that gets mentioned once during an orientation walk, and then mostly forgotten until the exact second it's needed, she cut hard toward the fence line, rather than continuing straight down the road, angling her run diagonally instead of directly away, which does something specific to a pursuing ostrich that a straight retreat doesn't. Ostriches, for all their explosive straight-line speed, are considerably less efficient at rapid changes of direction compared to running in a committed straight line, largely a function of the same long-legged, high-speed running mechanics that make them so fast in the first place. A bird moving at or near top speed needs meaningfully more distance and time to alter its heading sharply compared to a slower moving or standing start. The same basic physics that make a sprinting human harder to tackle when they cut at an angle rather than running predictably straight. By angling toward the fence rather than running the length of the open road, she forced the bird to either slow down to adjust its pursuit angle, costing it precious ground and time, or commit to its existing line and overshoot her position slightly, which is closer to what actually happened. The ostrich, already at nearly full speed when she made her cut, couldn't fully correct in time and swept past several feet wider than a direct pursuit would have allowed, buying her the handful of seconds she needed for the next part of the plan. And the next part of the plan was the fence itself. Standard 4-foot livestock wire fencing, the kind that does absolutely nothing to contain an adult ostrich determined to go through, over, or around it, but which represents something genuinely useful to a human being in a dangerous encounter with one, a physical barrier a person can put themselves partially behind or use to break an animal's direct line of approach, even if it wouldn't stop a fully committed charge outright. She reached the fence line roughly 2 seconds after her angled cut, close enough behind the overshooting bird that she had a brief window before he could reorient, and rather than trying to climb it, which farm safety literature on ostrich encounters consistently warns against, given how much time and exposed vulnerability a climb requires compared to the speed of a recovering ostrich, she instead dropped low and put the fence line directly between herself and the bird's most likely angle of reapproach, using the wire and the fence posts as a partial obstruction while continuing to move laterally along it, rather than staying still. This detail, staying low and moving along an obstruction rather than freezing or trying to fully scale it, echoes something that shows up across a surprising number of large animal encounters, and it's worth pulling out as its own point because it applies far beyond ostriches specifically. A charging animal, whether it's a territorial bird, an aggressive livestock bull, or any number of other large creatures capable of outrunning a human directly, is generally reacting to and tracking a relatively continuous, predictable target. Introducing a partial obstacle, even one that wouldn't stop the animal if it were fully committed to going through it, forces a moment of reassessment, a break in the direct pursuit line that buys time, and that time, measured in a second or two, is very often the entire margin between an encounter that ends with a few scrapes and one that ends with a genuine, life-threatening injury from that 4-inch claw connecting with real force. The ostrich, overshooting his line and then finding his direct path partially obstructed by the fence and the farmhand's lateral movement along it, broke off the pursuit roughly 6 seconds into the encounter, wheeling around in a wide, still fast arc back toward the open paddock gate and the female he'd been defending in the first place. His territorial objective essentially accomplished the moment the perceived intruder had been driven off his immediate ground, rather than allowed to continue walking directly toward his mate. This is a pattern that shows up constantly in territorial animal encounters across completely different species, and it's worth understanding because it reframes what actually happened here in a useful way. The bird wasn't hunting her the way a predator hunts prey it intends to kill and consume. He was driving off a perceived threat to a specific defended space and a specific defended mate, and once that threat had been pushed back far enough, the behavioral trigger that launched the charge in the first place resolved itself, and the pursuit ended, almost as abruptly as it had begun. She made it back down the road to the main farm buildings a few minutes later, shaken, breathing hard, with a scraped forearm from the fence wire and nothing worse, and the property owner, once the story had been pieced together, found the improperly latched gate and secured it properly before anyone went anywhere near that paddock again. No serious injury, no emergency room visit, a genuinely close call that resolved itself through a combination of quick recognition, a specific piece of remembered advice, and terrain that, while initially looking like a trap with no way out, actually offered a usable option in the fence line running alongside it, once she knew to use it as something other than simply a wall she was boxed in against. Now here's the piece of this story that deserves real attention, because it explains why an animal most people never think to take seriously ends up seriously injuring or occasionally killing people almost every year on farms and ranches around the world, and it comes down almost entirely to underestimation. People who work around cattle, horses, or other large livestock generally arrive with at least some baseline respect for the animal's size and potential danger, built in from a lifetime of cultural messaging about bulls and horse kicks and the general common sense that something that outweighs you by half a ton deserves caution. Ostriches don't get that same instinctive respect, partly because of exactly the cartoonish cultural reputation we opened this whole story with, and partly because, standing calmly in a paddock, an ostrich genuinely can look almost comically ungainly, all neck and legs and feathers. Nothing about the resting posture screams danger, the way a bull's lowered head or a stallion's pinned ears immediately does to someone with basic animal handling instincts. That gap between how dangerous the animal actually is and how dangerous it looks in its default non-aggressive state is precisely the gap that gets inexperienced farm workers, and sometimes experienced ones, who've simply grown too comfortable, seriously hurt. Agricultural safety researchers who track livestock-related injuries have documented ostrich and emu attacks as a small but consistent category within broader rat-teat farming injury data, with kicks accounting for the significant majority of serious injuries, frequently involving deep lacerations, broken bones, and in a documented number of cases going back decades, fatal abdominal injuries from a direct kick, particularly when the animal manages to strike someone who's already down or off balance, since a follow-up kick delivered to someone on the ground carries substantially more risk of penetrating injury than the same kick delivered to someone standing and able to absorb or partially deflect the impact. This is part of why the specific advice about staying on your feet, using obstacles rather than trying to outrun the bird directly, and never turning your back to walk or run in a completely straight, predictable line, shows up so consistently across the limited but real body of ostrich safety literature that exists for farm workers, breeders, and increasingly, staff at the wildlife parks and safari operations where the public sometimes encounters these birds in settings that feel far more casual than the animal's actual capabilities warrant. It's also worth talking about why this specific piece of advice, cutting at an angle rather than running straight, and using a partial obstacle rather than either standing frozen or attempting a full climb, actually made it into the farmhand's head in the first place. Because it wasn't something she'd sought out on her own initiative, it was a single mention during a property orientation months earlier that she almost certainly wouldn't have consciously recalled if asked cold, out of context on any ordinary day. This is a pattern that comes up again and again in accounts of people surviving fast-moving animal encounters across completely different species and completely different environments. The specific piece of information that ends up mattering most in the moment is very often something absorbed passively, almost incidentally, well before the encounter itself, sitting dormant until the exact circumstances that make it relevant show up and pull it back to the surface almost involuntarily. It's a strong argument, honestly, for taking farm and wildlife safety orientations seriously, even when the specific scenario being described feels remote or unlikely in the moment it's delivered, because the entire value of that information is precisely that you don't get to choose when you'll need it, and you generally don't get any meaningful time to look it up once the situation that requires it has actually started. There's a broader pattern worth drawing out here too, one that connects this story to a lot of other animal encounters, even though ostriches and, say, large predators like sharks or bears operate on completely different biological logic. In almost every one of these scenarios, the actual danger isn't really about the animal being some kind of malicious, calculating threat. The ostrich wasn't hunting the farmhand. He was doing exactly what territorial male ostriches during breeding season are wired by millions of years of evolutionary pressure to do when a perceived intruder walks toward a defended mate on defended ground. And once that threat had been driven back, the behavior resolved cleanly and completely, the bird returning to the paddock without any further pursuit or lingering aggression. The danger comes almost entirely from a mismatch between the animal's actual capabilities, that speed, those legs, that claw, and how casually those capabilities tend to get treated by people who share space with the animal, regularly enough to grow comfortable, which is exactly the same complacency risk that shows up with any animal that seems calm during 90% of encounters, before a specific set of conditions, flips a switch that most people never learn to watch for. The specific numbers around ostrich speed and kick force sound almost unbelievable, stacked up against how the bird actually looks standing in a field, calmly pecking at grain, and that gap between appearance and actual capability is really the entire lesson buried inside this story. 43 miles an hour, on legs that look almost comically thin. A 4-inch claw capable of the kind of damage most people associate with large predator attacks, rather than a bird best known, in popular culture, for supposedly burying its head in the sand. Which, worth mentioning, they don't actually do. That particular myth almost certainly comes from ostriches lowering their heads to the ground to turn and check on eggs buried in shallow nest scrapes. a behavior that from a distance can look like the head disappearing into the earth, but has nothing whatsoever to do with hiding from danger. If anything, the real behavior is close to the exact opposite of that myth. An ostrich under threat doesn't hide. It stands its ground, drops its head into that low, forward, rigid posture, and comes straight at whatever it's decided represents the danger, which is precisely the animal this farmhand found herself facing down on an open road, with no way off except the one narrow option she managed to find and use in the handful of seconds she actually had. If you're the kind of person who spends real time around livestock, or even if you just find these encounters as fascinating as we do, the practical takeaway from this one is fairly simple and fairly specific. Territorial posture matters. The neck drop, the wing spread, the stiff-legged strut, these are documented, consistent warning signs that show up before a charge, not during or after one, which means there's a genuine window to react if you know what you're watching for. Straight-line retreat plays to the animal's single greatest physical advantage, so an angled path and any usable obstacle, even a fence that couldn't actually contain the bird itself, change the calculation meaningfully in your favor. And staying on your feet, moving deliberately rather than freezing, matters here in a very concrete, very physical way, given exactly how much more dangerous a follow-up kick becomes once someone's already down. None of that information does much good sitting unused in the back of your head during an ordinary, uneventful walk down a farm road. It only matters in the 4 seconds it takes an ostrich at full speed to close 240 feet, and the entire value of learning it now, well before you ever need it, is making sure it's already there, ready to surface, the one time it actually counts. That's the whole sequence. A gate rattled loose by an overnight wind, a male bird reading a familiar face as an intruder near his mate, and a stretch of open farm road with seemingly nowhere to go that turned out to have exactly one usable option, if you knew to look for it and had 4 seconds to find it. If close calls like this one, the ones that come from somewhere nobody expects, the ones hiding behind an animal everybody underestimates, are the kind of thing you want more of, subscribe, because there's a lot more of this kind of story out there, and every single one of them has something worth knowing before you're the one standing on that road.